Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. I have a special guest today, Charles Haywood. So, just FYI, guys, the machine knows that I'm opposed to it, which is why it delayed us by half an hour. There's a lot of technicalities which are kind of stupid, but we solved it. And I'm really glad to have Charles with us tonight. So, as a brief introduction, I first heard about you, I think, through Orrin McIntyre. And I saw your interview with him. And then I went to the Worthy House and I saw that it's your book reviews slash, your own philosophy kind of thing. And I started looking at what you were saying. So, your idea is foundationalism, the idea that, and technology is a big part of that. And I thought that kind of caught my attention. And I also saw that you engaged with the likes of Uncle Ted and John Michael Greer. And I'm like, well, this is interesting. You don't often find techno optimists that will engage with these people in a way that is treating them, with the respect that I think they deserve. And I thought, well, this is the conversation that needs to happen. So thank you very much, Charles, for being here.
I'm pleased to be here.
So just briefly for the audience, I think the best way to start is, could you express your view on technology in a nutshell? Then I'll give mine, and then we can sort of go into it.
Sure. So as you say, my view on technology is techno-optimist, but that does not mean I'm a techno-Pollyanna in the sense that I understand and see and, in a sense, embrace many of the problems, defects, evils even that technology bring. Nonetheless, my opinion in a nutshell is that a well-run society can properly channel and use technology to achieve the ends of human flourishing and virtue.
Okay. Briefly, I'll just say that for technology, you can sort of, my view can sort of be divided into these four parts. So one, how do I define technology? I use the definition of Jacques Ellul from his book On Technique. And technique, which is translated from the French as technology or techniques, means one, efficient. So it's the overarching goal or drive for efficiency. Efficiency can be, on the one hand, mechanical efficiency, like a machine working better, but also it includes efficiency of human organization. So improvement in management techniques and the like. One of the costs that this imposes is the idea of social plasticity, where in order to facilitate a malleable, atomized society for the purposes of transferring information, rooted organic structures such as families, clans, guilds, and city-states get shredded by this process, which then creates what is called in the paleocon spheres anarcho-tyranny. We have tyranny from the top and anarchy at the bottom. So the state is now sovereign and supreme, which is itself under technique. And then the idea of the modem society, where man relates to the machine as a modem, so it modulates, demodulates signals from one part of the machine to the other, rather than man to man. And then from Ivan Illich, I take the idea of the three ages of tools. So the first two ages of tools can be seen as the idea of instrumentality, where it's the primary nature of instrumentality is that man relates to the world through the use of tools. And that ended, according to Illich, in the 1980s. The first period of the age of instrumentality is the age of organon, where the hand, the tool, and the hand using the tool are all considered the same thing. The tool is an extension of a human body. Think of the samurai and the way of the sword. You and the sword are one. And the second age within instrumentality is the age of tools, distality. Distality means distance, so there's distance between the hand and the tool. And so now the tool has an intention imbued in itself. So a hammer is something that hammers nails, or a sword is a thing that cuts, rather than a thing used by warriors and blacksmiths, or blacksmiths and warriors, rather. And then lastly, we have what he calls the age of systems and cybernetics, where man now becomes a subcomponent, because in systems theory, right, the man and the device are themselves a part of a larger system. And so becoming a part of a larger system, man is now, the distance between man and tool is annihilated again, but this time in favor of the tool or the system, which Illich views as dehumanizing. And the idea of disembodied man interacting with other disembodied men in this age of systems, he sees as creating problems from a more traditionalist point of view, where we used to relate to each other man to man. And we have Joseph Tainer's idea of collapse, the idea of overinvestments and complexity based on the principles of The law of diminishing returns. You can only invest in something the same way so long before the returns don't yield the results you want. And he believes that with technology and complexity, we are reaching limits beyond which that mode of solving problems won't work. And then that is what he says leads to collapse. And by collapse, I mean going from a higher energy state to a lower energy state. And then we have the idea of catabolic collapse from Joseph Tainter and John Michael Greer, collapse that takes place in stages, because let's call it the empire is a system of systems, and each system has a subsystem. So these don't all collapse at once. And as the empire runs into the red in order to maintain the black, in its decayed state, it doesn't have the same sense of initiative, so it's easier to cannibalize. And each cannibalizing process reaches an equilibrium, or it's stasis for a while, and then it collapses again. And then lastly, the author who introduced me to these two other authors, James Howard Kunstler, I believe his view of world made by hand, where man and his society is local again, his relationship with tools is more prevalent of earlier societal representations, such as the Age of Organon, is a likely, though not necessary, future. I think it's becoming increasingly more likely. So that's where I stand on tools and technology. So now that we've both sort of cleared the air as to what we think, so I know you've already engaged with JMG before, Charles. So to what extent? Well, let's go this way. So I think what you've said before, because I did read your review of John Michael Greer's book about the future, this future society that's set in the 1940s level of technology. The idea being that, the idea that you can budget for the cost of technology. Retrotopia, thank you. So the idea that you could sort of budget for the costs, and I think that's where the discussion is going to hinge. Can the cost of technology be budgeted for? So could you give your presentation of how you think that would work, how the cost of technology could be managed?
I think that's probably not precisely the right way to go about it, because the idea of budgeting implies that you can plan precisely for the future. And this is a fundamental flaw in thinking of people across the political spectrum, as well as people who are philo-technological or anti-technological. Of the people you talk about, I'm very familiar with Kunstler and Greer, and who was the middle one? So I mean, you basically, the people you discuss, basically you move kind of from more philosophical to less philosophical. So you start with Ellul, or Tainter, of course, was the other one. So you start with Ellul and Illich, and you have I think things that are very good in terms of analytical frame for looking at technology. It's very hard to criticize a lot of what Ellul and Illich say analytically, and then you get in the question of Tainter, or the works of Tainter, the one work that everyone's familiar with, the collapse of complex societies. You get his analysis, his historical analysis, which he does not claim predictive value for necessarily, but is meant to be predictive, obviously. And then you get people like Greer and Kunstler, who are basically a combination of fiction and philosophy writers who predict what the future will be. And both of them predict a lower energy state future, in essence, which brings us back to your question, in essence, about budgeting for the future. The problem with all of these things is that in the former case, that is the philosophers, Ellul and so on, is that they imagine a world that could be different than the one we have. And while that's true in a sense, the world they imagine is basically one where none of these things happened. So analytically, I think it's interesting to say the things that Ellul and Illich say, but it's basically not very useful to the average person or to a political planner, simply because those things are not what happened. We are where we are. We are, and I think you and I agree, in a technological bad place. You're familiar with Paul Kingsnorth?
Yes.
So, I mean, you use the term the machine, which he also uses as well, but I don't know if you use it in exactly the same sense. But I think we can all agree that our current state vis-a-vis technology, that is society vis-a-vis technology, is fairly atrocious. You've talked about this before, and there's no reason to go through an enumeration of all the ways it's atrocious, but 99% or 95%, probably closer to 99%, of the way that society interacts with technology today is atrocious. That doesn't necessarily mean, though, again, back to budgeting, that what we're going to see is the world made by hand, Kunstler kind of future. Because I think what people fall down on this is they imagine that we have to have one thing or the other. We have to have the machine, or we have to have coopers and ironsmiths working next to the village green. As it happens, I like coopers and ironsmiths working next to Village Green. I'm kind of a gentleman farmer. I have all these animals. I kind of like that, but that's not the way the future is going to be, because even if we have a catabolic collapse, that is moving to a lower energy state, the fact is that most of this technology, or much of this technology, just isn't going away entirely. So this idea that we're all going to run around using steam locomotives just doesn't make any sense at all. And King's North falls into that a little bit too, where he thinks that we may go farther down than I think is likely. That's just the reality of it, because it's not that hard to do a lot of things. Yes, it's true that you may not be able to make microchips without the right set of inputs, but you can always make mustard gas, but it's not that hard. I understand. I haven't really looked into it because that's not really in my immediate plans. But a lot of the things that the technology has brought us are going to stick around. So in terms of budgeting for the future, I don't think that really makes a lot of sense. I think the question is, how can we, after what I anticipate to be a societal future, make technology a servant of man rather than what it is now, which is its master?
Right. One thing that I didn't bring up, and I think this is a question that brings to the question of collapse. So while certainly the quote capital stock, you're correct, will not just disappear. Like, it'll still be there whether or not the political systems that support them remain there. The adjoining question then is access to cheap enough energy, which was the question of the EROIs, energy return on energy investments.
Yes.
A lot of the less philosophical types, so again, JMG, Tainter, and Kunstler, all seem to think that, and again, the important thing to understand about peak energy of any kind, whether it's peak oil or peak gas or whatever, is not that the reserves are going to run out, though at some point they might. That's not the claim. The claim is that the energy return on energy investment will reach a negative where you'll lose energy trying to pull that energy out of the ground, such that it's no longer thermodynamically feasible to do so. And then the argument then goes, once you hit this theoretical point, then you're going to have the idea of these capital stock will still be there, but they'll just be these rusted hulks because there's no way to power them. Now, the Kunstler calls these people the cornucopians. And he says a cornucopian would say, well, look, we'll just invent new energy sources. And that's where he then goes to Tainter and points to diminishing returns. And the other thing, too, is even if that were feasible, I think you and I would both agree that the empire we're living in now isn't really capable of creating those inventors. They're not capable of creating Edisons, even if it were possible, theoretically.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree with that. I mean, I did a review of William Gibson's book, Neuromancer, where I discussed all the various reasons why our current society is incapable of advancement in the technological realm. I mean, real advancement. I am not a strong AI is never coming. Chat GPT is a farce, et cetera. So advancement of all kinds, negative and positive, I think is ground to a halt. I have a lot of sympathy on the return on investment or the return on energy analysis that Greer does, which, as you say, is related to Tainter. The one thing that Greer ignores, though, is that he may not ignore this everywhere, but he ignored it in the stuff I've written of him. There is a functionally infinite amount of coal, and he ignores this. And he says that global warming is coming for us, and then global warming will do what global warming is going to do, and then global warming will eventually go away because people won't be pumping carbon into the atmosphere. But the reality is that while coal is not a perfect substitute for other kinds of fossil fuels, particularly in the chemical realm, in terms of simple power, there's 1,000 years worth of coal at our current rate just in the United States. So I'm not quite sure what Greer says about that. I do agree that this is a real problem, that eventually the energy will run out or become economically infeasible to extract. And I think Greer's analysis is very good there and something that's ignored in the larger discourse. I don't think it's impossible that people will invent something new and better, but I will admit to being more pessimistic about that than I would have been a few years ago. I'm probably less cornucopian than I would have been in the past, in part because we're not going to do it. Nobody else in the world is going to do it. We have a collapse in births, and it's young men who produce everything of value that has ever been seen in society. And so with no young men, or with no young men being allowed to do what they need to do, we're not going to have any new inventions anywhere in the globe. So all these things are problems, I agree, but it's not clear to me we're going to run out of energy imminently.
Right. So I guess we could say there's like two components to this then. The one is, no, I don't have anything to say about coal, because most of the EROIs I've looked into would be like oil and natural gas, things which I think are a lot more at risk, so to speak, of being infeasible to get. What that would mean, though, right? Say from the point of view, let's run with this, because again, I can't say I agree or disagree with your view on coal. I haven't looked into it, but let's say that for the sake of argument, it is true. That would still probably lead to a civilization no more complicated than the 19th century, which would still mean that a lot of the technology that we take for granted today would be infeasible to power using that kind of technology.
Why is that, though? I mean, coal has been used for 100 years to do massive megawatt power generation. And with electricity, there's certain things you can't do chemically, but the oil is not going to disappear entirely. Extracting oil for burning it may become economically infeasible, but extracting oil to use it as a raw material with using electricity to convert it into other useful chemicals does not seem to me to be imminently ending.
Well, okay, but I think cars wouldn't be able to survive that kind of economy.
Well, no, I think we can't all go electric because there's not enough. This idea that we're all going to have an infinite supply of batteries and so on is a farce. But that's not the 19th century. Just because individual cars, say you woke up tomorrow and having a car costs 10 times what it costs today, fewer people would obviously have cars. But as with everything, people would make adjustments to that. They would carpool, public transport would become more feasible. Well, they just wouldn't move around. I mean, we already see some of that with remote work. I mean, I think very little of remote work as a business thing. But the fact is that remote work relies on basically electricity and a few amount of other computer chips and so on. So it's not clear at all to me that if we woke up in the morning and natural gas and oil as sources of fuel generation disappeared, that the world will be all that different than it is now.
Well, I mean, for example, a lot of what we use for mobility purposes is you can't burn coal for that. Like jets can't burn coal. You can't burn coal with cars. So I mean,
but oil's not going to disappear. You could still fly jets. It would just cost 10 times as much, because oil is going to cost 10 times as much.
And you'd probably have fewer people doing it.
Right, but then we're back to the 1970. I'm old enough that I can remember when flying was an expensive privilege. Now, of course, the flying's cheap as dirt, and everything's a clown show when you fly. Maybe it'd be good to go back to expensive flying. If you can afford it, then you can fly like a prince.
Right. Now again, the issue with Painter and then JMG and Kunstler is a lot of this is predictive. And the same goes for the cornucopians. They're both making predictions about the future, which we haven't seen yet. I think basically, if you think one is more convincing than the other, it's going to be based on other priors.
Who have a better track record?
Well, which one has a better track record? But also, a lot of times people just jump the gun, right? We can think of like prophets in the Old Testament didn't jump the gun. They didn't give 1988, this is what's going to happen, guys. They said something bad was going to happen, and people kept on saying, it's fine, it's fine, it's fine. And then the bad thing happened, and then it was over. Because they'll tell Jeremiah, well, look, everything's fine, Jeremiah. What are you talking about? And then bam, right? So I think the problem with at least some of these,
they didn't treat him nicely as a result, though.
No, but what I'm saying is the track record when you make a prophecy, these people, because they have chosen times, like an actual year, then that gives you a black eye. That's going to be bad, and I think that does hurt them. But if you make a general claim and you don't say exactly when it's going to happen, but if you follow trends, I think that's a different kind of claim.
Yeah, but my question really was an objective question. In the past, have the cornucopians or the catastrophists been correct over, say, the past 70 years?
Sure. I mean, the cornucopians have been correct.
Right. And so, I mean, there's a book by Charles Mann, The Wizard and the Prophet, which I think is very good, which talks about this. So obviously, past performance is no guarantee of future results, et cetera, et cetera. But the fact is that the cornucopians and the catastrophists have been having this argument for a long time. And while I'm very sympathetic to the catastrophists, and I'm kind of an accelerationist catastrophist myself, I see certain benefits to catastrophe. the reality is that all the catastrophists have been definitively disproven every single time so far. Maybe, I mean, I agree that's not a guarantee of any future, but Kunstler was saying in 2007 during the financial crisis that peak oil was imminent and world made by hand was imminent, and here we are in 2023 and it is not imminent. So I mean, much of what even the catastrophists we're talking about now have specifically predicted has been so far totally disproven.
I would yes, but I would say this with the cornucopians though, right? On the one hand, there's a way the story's told where on one hand the cornucopians always get it wrong because they always overpromise, they always overpredict. So for example, I remember growing up in the aughts when the army was bragging about having Star Wars robot army with lasers and everybody with a computer on their backpack. Never happened, and people just kind of shelved that and forgot about it. We were supposed to have drones delivering us packages from Amazon in 2014. Didn't happen. So on the one hand too, or look at predictions about the future made in the 1950s. 2000 was supposed to be a certain way, and it wasn't anything like what the utopian futurists of the 50s were predicting. So in their own way, the cornucopians are always wrong.
Absolutely. I totally agree with this. And I've written on this extensively that the future that I was promised has never showed up. And the classic example, which is so commonly adduced now as to be a gag, but I can remember this when I was, say, less than 10 years old. Nuclear fusion is 20 years away. I mean, that's a classic. But the example I like to talk about is 2004 presidential election, which I'm old enough, and I don't know if you're old enough to have really paid attention to that. But the 2004 presidential was run entirely over the claim by the Democrats that stem cells would make us all live forever and fix all of our diseases, and the evil Republicans were preventing it. And of course, I mean, in health in general, while there have been certain small advancements, none of the stuff I've been promised in my lifetime has arrived, right? Richard Nixon declared he was going to end cancer in 1972 or 1971. So, now we both know a lot of people who have died of cancer, I would imagine. So I totally agree with that. The cornucopians have been proved right in the sense that their disagreement with the catastrophists are improved wrong, but the other predictions that the cornucopians make have not panned out. But
because the way that I view the cornucopians is it's sort of like the way I view socialists. So if you look at the socialists that predicted, say, in the Soviet Union and beyond, all of these glittering, wonderful future, which never transpired, obviously. But then they will point to, well, look, we actually did do these things. I'm like, well, yes, you did. But even these positive things you did, that was not what you promised. You lowered the bar for what you promised after the glittering future didn't come. And that's a lot of the power of the cornucopians. They make these promises that don't really fully come true, but enough cool stuff happens that people forget that and they move on. And I think what your position sounds like to me is more like a moderate optimist. You're not a cornucopian because you admit that they've made a lot of mistakes. And you're saying, though, but from your point of view, it sounds like what you're saying to me is that you agree with them in the sense that they have this view that technology can solve a lot of problems, but not to the same degree that they do.
I think that's correct. I think it's also a question of emphasis. That is, I actually bestirred myself to go look up Ray Kurzweil the other day. You remember Ray Kurzweil? I think he's still around.
Oh, yeah.
He was telling us all in 2006 how we're going to upload our brains by 2015 and all this like completely insane stuff. But I think it's a question of focus. That is, I think a lot of what the cornucopians nowadays promise fundamentally revolve around transhumanism, which I think is both likely impossible, but also just bad on every level. Bad for society, bad spiritually, and so on. So when I'm an optimist about things that are I guess on two axes, not what the cornucopians want, not transhumanist and not focused on, back to some of the stuff you said at the very beginning, disintermediating people from the other people or making people atomized servants of the state. So areas of technology that focus on that are obviously feasible because they surround us, but they should be destroyed. And so transhumanism isn't going to happen, but should be squashed. Disintermediation should be destroyed along with everybody involved in it. But other areas of technology, primarily space exploration and other kind of, heroic achievements, for lack of a better term, I think should be strongly encouraged. I think it's a question of emphasis more than anything else.
Sure. Now you mentioned earlier, and I think this is actually an interesting point to go back to, is how does one relate to technology now? Because one can take a pessimistic view that technology is going to take a downward slope in innovation and development, One could take a more optimistic view, but regardless of which view you take, where we're at now, we are still going to have to deal with the current level of technical development. Now, for those of us that are on the right that want to preserve what we might call traditional norms and values, the problem that we've seen is that as technology advances, this becomes increasingly difficult. Fewer people are able to do it. And even those that are able to do it, it's increasingly difficult for them to maintain the process of doing it. And then that becomes the real question that we've seen with the American right in general, right? I mean, I remember in the early 2000s when the American right was really hardcore on a lot of social issues that you couldn't imagine them talking about that same way today.
Sure.
I mean, they were throwing the P word patriarchy all over the place back in the day. You wouldn't see them doing that today. So I think this is where actually, what? Except you. Yes, except you. But I think where Illich comes in handy now is his classification of the way man relates to tools. Because I think a lot of the difficulty that we're having now is this obviously predates the age of systems, but once we have the age of systems, which he identifies with the computer age in the 80s, there's this now much larger force, you could say almost like a supermassive gravitational object pulling us toward itself because it's imposing all of these costs on us. So for example, a hammer, which could go back to you could use it in the age of instrumentality, either as an organon or as a distance object. But when you're done, you put it in the drawer in your wood shop and it's not having any influence on you at all. Global telecommunications isn't like that. It has an influence on you even when you're sleeping. It's always on. And so it's a fundamentally different kind of thing than a hammer. So I think the first thing is sort of talking about how we could even classify these tools. And I think, I've said this myself. I used to be of an opinion a lot closer to yours, that, these are just tools and we could just meet them, on the same level, man to man, man to tool, and figure out some way to manage them. And that's still true for some tools, but I think that's not true for others.
I think, yes, but I think the missing element in that analysis is, and it's really a two-part element, is the society within which we're embedded. And by two-part, I mean society consists of the mass of people and the governing elite, Gaetano Mosca's governing elite. And in our current incarnation, both of these are awful. The ruling elite is awful in a different way than the masses are awful, but it's nonetheless true that virtue is lacking in both. And so it's obviously the case that this tool or these tools are not being managed in any way whatsoever. They're simply being absorbed, or rather, to the extent they are being managed, they're being used to manipulate and destroy us. So, again, I guess this is kind of like the catastrophists always predicting the future, but it never having yet arrived, yet seeming plausible. You can imagine a society or some set of society where a better ruling elite and a more virtuous group of the masses behave in a completely different way in relation to their tools. And you can see that obviously in certain subsects. At one extreme, you have the Mennonites and the Amish and so on. But even the Amish are perhaps a good example. I'm hardly an expert on the Amish, but the Amish, and there's a range of behavior and belief among the Amish, acknowledge the use of some forms of modern technology as helpful and acceptable within their frame. On a larger scale, you could imagine an entire society adopting some rigorous approach like that.
Right. So a couple points to be made here. In principle, I think that case can be made. But what I'm saying, though, is notice, though, even with the Amish and the Mennonites, there's certain kinds of technology that they're not using, or at least they're not building and maintaining. They might use because it's available within the broader system that we have now. I question whether that would be available in the kind of world that you're imagining, because I think there's certain kinds of technologies that can't be related to in that way. So again, like I said, going back to the hammer, you can sort of imagine relating to that man to tool and having like a more or less fairly equal power distribution between the two. But if you're going up against the global telecommunications system or some sort of large industrial firm for transportation, like railroads, the highway system, or shipping, well, now you have to have some sort of larger group, and maybe you would say that's the state. Maybe that's the state's role to step in and equalize that relationship between a large economic or large technical structure, and to do that. that's one thing. The second thing I'd say is in Ellul's idea, Ellul's idea of the modem society. So you mentioned virtue in your foundationalism, and classic example of practical applied virtue is the Roman Republic. That's what they were renowned for. Even the Greek historians like Plutarch gave the Romans their due. Mm-hmm. Now, the way virtue was developed in a sort of political sense was that the sort of state itself was considered a sort of corporate body. We have Menenius's story from a parable of the Senate as the stomach from Coriolanus, which then Shakespeare puts into his play. The idea then that this is an organic body, this is of men composing the state. Whereas in the idea of a modem society, which is what Ellul is describing modern technological society as, we don't primarily relate to each other man to man, but man to machine. So if you wanted food or clothes or shelter, you wanted to find a Roman patronage system. And then if you weren't a wealthy patrician, that is, and then somehow relate to him as a person. Now, in order to avoid the moral hazard of free riding, virtue was the sort of coin of the realm, where no, I'm a virtuous person. You should put me in your patronage network, and that way, you can trust me not to riff off you. Whereas if you're relating to the machine, like in The Machine Stops, chapter 3, it says the machine feeds us, the machine clothes us. It fundamentally reorients how we relate to not only each other, but relating to getting resources. And this is where I think it becomes a tension of maintaining virtue, because virtue isn't going to help you get resources in this new situation because you're dealing with a machine and the technicians behind it.
Well, let me ask you a question, because you're more intimately familiar, way more familiar than I am, with both Ellul and Illich. I mean, they were writing, well, a couple decades before now, 30, 40 years. And when that discussion where you just talked about how man relates to the machine, most people nowadays would think of that as an internet type thing. So if you just erase the internet, most people would think that people would then relate to each other much more directly rather than through the machine. At least I would off the cuff. But Ellul and Illich were clearly writing before the internet. So I guess my question is, now that we've seen the internet, is it really the case that in, say, 1975, people were being intermediated by the machine in a way that was as debilitating as it became later? And if we went back to that world of 1975, would it seem as debilitating to us as it did to them?
Well, one, I don't think it would be as debilitating, because the dependency is still less, right? So as you go from a pre-industrial civilization to an industrial civilization to a digital civilization, dependency on first the state and then these more advanced corporate structures develops over time as becoming more and more dependent. So, for example, a good example of this pivot point is World War II. So the two greatest Allied American commanders, George S. Patton and Douglas MacArthur, were steeped in the classical tradition. They were steeped in this tradition of virtue and courage and honor that you're trying to restore. And that made them the greatest commanders in both theaters of World War II. But they didn't really fit in. They never made it to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Patton was often in the doghouse because he didn't play ball. And it's because the U.S. military at the time became this sort of like systems technology military, where we were going to have the most advanced tech, the biggest bombs, the best everything technologically, where now those people become a liability, and they were weeded out of the military to the point where you don't see them at all now.
Sure.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, I think that's true. And I think this is a big problem, that the military demands tend to accelerate these kind of problems very, very aggressively, simply because at that point, the efficiency is, just a second. Efficiency is paramount, and so people don't really care. Even if they know about the problems that will result, they'll go down this path of systems as you outline. I don't really have a solution for that. I do think, though, that there's a big problem on the right in general, pointing out how things have come along so far historically and saying that therefore they're inevitable. That is, my entire premise, kind of a broader political premise, is that the poison that affects us today began with the Enlightenment, and it can be completely erased, and we can proceed on some other entirely different vector. And so while it is true in the past that the systems and the problems you describe have developed organically through various demands that have been placed upon society, it's entirely possible that with forewarned is forearmed, and we could take a different path in the future. So, for example, as you mentioned, the state, if the state simply turned off the internet entirely, you could imagine that. I mean, this is the kind of, it's related to a book I highly recommend to people, Fitzpatrick's War by Theodore Judson, which is this kind of future history of the 26th century, but describes events kind of presciently in the 21st century. And among them is things like the state turning off things like the internet. If the state turned off the internet, we would all be vastly better off. And if people say, well, how would that happen? I mean, that would be trivially easy to execute.
Well, yeah. So that would be trivially easy to execute if there was the will to do so.
Sure.
Given the interconnectedness of all of society. So I think the first thing that I would say is I in agreement with this analytical description that Alul and others give, I believe that technique, basically, it was a sort of autonomously developed. The idea being that, well, look, it really works really, really well. And if we all do this together, it works even better. Mm-hmm. And it just creates this sort of like ratchet effect naturally, where people just keep doing it and doing it and doing it. But then it kind of creates this autonomous parallel organism or unorganism, if you will. And I think the Enlightenment actually is a reaction to that. It's a philosophical attempt at trying to create norms for humans to use to operate within this radically new system, which, if you take a completely agrarian rural norms of like the 17th century anywhere in Europe or America, that wouldn't work at all in this modern society. Now, does that mean we have to do the Enlightenment in the future? No, it doesn't. But I do think that there's this internal pressure to integrate into the machine such that whatever solution is chosen is less optimal from the point of view of a more tradition-oriented society. Because if you want to get your needs met, you're going to have to work through, not say other people per se, but at least people who represent the machine.
Sure. And you've talked about Francis Bacon in the past, the improvement of man's estate. I mean, that's always going to be a demand.
Yeah, exactly. And so then the question is, to what extent then can the pursuit of things like honor, virtue, and truth in the lives of an individual be consistent with mechanical society, and to what extent it can't? And then once that question's asked, the next question you have to ask is, depending on the answer you get, what ought we to do in the future? And so for me, I'm very skeptical about at least certain kinds of technology. So I'm not a primitivist. I wouldn't say go back to Stone Age, or like go back to some ideal level of technology in 1100 AD or 1500 AD. I think what I would say is, if we go back to the way of looking at tools that Illich describes in the first age, the age of Organon, how would technology or technique develop under that social norm? Mm-hmm. Because we don't have that social norm anymore. That's long since been abandoned in favor first of distality and then of systems. And so obviously technology developed from the Stone Age until 1200, the time frame Illich gives us. So how would it develop? And furthermore, from where we're at now, how would it develop differently? I don't know. But I think that that's what I would want to say as a proffered solution to this tension.
Well, I'm not sure we have any real fundamental disagreement. I mean, you touch on social norm, and I think that's exactly right. Our social norm now is extremely individualist. And I mean, I think this is large part a consequence of the Enlightenment, and I think there's a variety of philosophical things there. But fundamentally, the individual is not expected to subscribe to social norms that reduce his feeling of empowerment and emancipation. And the reality is that in order to go back to viewing the tool as separate from man, you would have to have extremely rigid social norms that would be considered suffocating by our current standards. That is, for example, if you engaged in certain kinds of technological behavior, you would be entirely ostracized by the community. I think this is awesome. I think we should bring back stigma and taboo, and the Scarlet Letter is awesome, and all these kind of things. But it'll be a very different society, and really the only way to do that would be to have a very strong religious backbone to the society. People aren't going to think themselves collectively, like the intellectual dark web, into thinking that, well, we should each choose to limit ourselves in order for the societal whole to be better. The reality is this is basically a religious impulse. And so you would need to have a religious backing and demand for this drop of focus on extreme individualism and increase in focus on limiting how we relate to our tools. There's really no other way to do it.
Right. Now, of course, this whole liberatory narrative of the progressives, of the Enlightenment, was, of course, facilitated itself by technology, because technology, in many ways, has liberated people from these traditional social norms. So, for example, birth control has liberated people from traditional sexual norms in a way that one could have conceived of such behavior on a wide scale, but it would have only been a conceptual reality rather than a reified reality, which it is now due to these specific technologies. So then the one question is, how do you put the genie back in the bottle? And then the other case is, once we've sort of classified tools along these lines, certain tools, I think, are going to be necessarily corrosive of traditional values because they provide certain moral hazards. Again, contraception is one of them. And what do you do with those? And how do you do with those? Because the real tension is, if it comes to the level of national defense, and it turns out such that some weapon systems necessary for national defense against a pure power are just those kinds of systems that erode social norms, then you're in a catch-22, because either you don't have them to preserve your social norms, or, as you see with the United States today, you lose your social norms in order to maintain pure military technology.
Well, I think that's true. I mean, on both axes, but contraception is a good example. The chemical contraception in particular has been an utter disaster for the human race. But in general, the idea that contraception is widespread and acceptable and everyone should have fewer children, which is something closely tied to that, it has been a disaster. So a state should simply ban that. But you can certainly legislate morality, but that's inadequate. There has to be huge social stigma to people who are able to and don't have numerous children, or people who choose not to marry. And obviously the later Romans had big problems with this too. And there's no magic bullet. The people are what the people are, no matter what the government legislates. But on the military thing, it's not clear to me what aspect of technology that is particularly bad nowadays is necessary for pure military capacity. That is, it turned out that George Bush lied to us, and it was not, in fact, necessary for us all to be surveilled by the security state in order to prevent terrorism. So it's not clear, and most weapon systems, sure, it's useful to have weapon systems networked, but it doesn't mean that those networks have to be available to people to behave, to look at their at OnlyFans or whatever. I mean, the military can have network systems that have no relationship whatsoever to the broader society. So it's not clear to me what technological element is necessary to be a military success, leaving aside the fact that the United States is probably going to lose the next war. But it's not clear what, for a variety of other reasons, it's not clear that if we were kind of at the top of our game, what things would be necessary for us to have that are corrosive for the broader society.
Well, you brought up, I think, a good point there with the idea of networking and communications. So on the one hand, you could theoretically say, okay, why couldn't this just be all done inside the state? I mean, after all, the internet was a DARPA project to begin with. Why not just keep it there? Well, one reason why you don't keep it there is because in the Western world, people want to make a profit, and you can take that out of the government and then use that to make profit in the private sector, and a lot of people did. And so then the question is, there's going to be the tension between the will of the government and the will of some people, some powerful rich people who want to take that out. But then there's also the maintenance problem. So, like, for example, in World War II, because we had an auto culture, most Americans, both in Europe and the Pacific, could very easily repair trucks and tanks in the field. And it was really easy for them to even just jerry-rig stuff. So if you have a highly complex technological military and you have a civilian society that's completely disconnected from it, there's going to be, even in its civilian uses, right? It's going to create this big learning curve for them to overcome. Whereas one of the advantages the U.S. had in World War II was there was no learning curve, because all of that technology was in the civilian hands in the form of cars and trucks. And so they could immediately jump right into it, whether it's a tank or a truck or a Jeep, and then work on it. So Yeah, you could still, not have that, but there's going to be the undercurrent economy beneath it. So even if you have a telecommunication system, but just for the government, they're still going to have to contract private firms to make this stuff. They're not going to make it themselves.
No, that's true. But I mean, the problem is that we have been told that the state lacks power except to oppress the little man. That is, the state lacks power against oligarchs. The classic counterexample of this is Vladimir Putin. Love him or hate him, whatever you may think of the Russia-Ukraine war. The fact is that in the 1990s, Russia was being turned into a third world country and being looted by Western oligarchs in cooperation with Russian oligarchs. And Putin came in and basically told the Russian oligarchs that they were either going to play ball with him and quit ripping off Russia as a whole, or they were going to all get shot or go to jail. And that is the ultimate origin of Putin's power. You could totally imagine someone in America doing the same thing. You just come in, you collect all the people who have gotten rich off of these corrosive technologies, and you announce that now their net worth is $50,000 and everything else has been taken. The end. Goodbye. And if you don't like it, well, you can be shot or put in jail for the rest of your life. And that's the way these things are done. Just because the oligarchs have gotten rich off of these things doesn't mean they should have been allowed to or need to be continued to be allowed to.
No, I mean that's a fair point. I mean, we've seen this with like Russia and other what we would call authoritarian regimes. The question then is there the political will in the United States now or in the future to do so?
No.
Yeah, no. And then the question is, okay, we have like the dark horse of the Red Caesar. Okay, well, maybe he comes, maybe he doesn't. Now, even if we look at, say, a society like, say, Russia that has the state firmly in charge over it directs technological development in as much as it can, and the corporate forces are under its thumb, and we can envision that. Now, that's definitely possible. It's feasible. We see it elsewhere in the world. It still, I don't think, removes all of the problems that we who would like to see a return to tradition and virtue would want. I mean, Russia right now is in a tailspin demographically, socially, because of the legacies of communism. Probably even going back to the bloodletting in World War II. But without going into all that, Russia has that. Let me sort of maybe steer the conversation this way. One of the things that was often common in the instruction of virtue that we saw both in classical and Christian sources was the idea that there needed to be schools of virtue, and life and the different phases, seasons, and modes of life were seen as schools of virtue, where you learn by doing virtue. Mm-hmm. And the way that you learned by doing was by engaging with other people in these professions or in these or maybe a schooling like academy setting. Whereas as technology replaces people in these sort of economic and social interactions, it's going to take a much more intentional way of having schools of virtue. Because now if you want to go out into the world, you're going to have to learn first and foremost how to interact with these systems in order to get the resources you need. So it's going to be, and again, that's an added cost on building virtue. Now, I mean, I agree with you. We should be pursuing and building virtue and tradition within the United States, but it's not so easy. It's not like in 1800 you could say, look, the whole world's a school of virtue. Just go out and learn. Because no,
I agree.
Because now with technology, in order to hack it, you're going to have to learn a whole bunch of other skills which have nothing to do with virtue. And so,
and this is a real problem. And I mean, it's not just that; it's that you can't be a generalist anymore. I mean, even 30 years ago, you could be much more of a generalist in terms of technology. Even 20 years ago. And now you not only have to know technology, you have to be specialized. And so you not only don't have any time for virtue, you don't have any time to learn anything except a relatively narrow area. I will note, by the way, I can only stick around for another 10 minutes because I do have a family and they do want their dinner.
So that's fine. I only go for about an hour anyhow.
But I think that there's really no solution for that as long as technology is woven so much into people's lives. But again, the internet is a good example of this. There's no benefit to the internet. There's no net. It's not even that the internet is good for productivity. I haven't seen like later numbers over the past couple of years, but up until very recently, it was not disputed that the internet, and for that matter, personal computers in general, had not increased productivity at all by standard measures. So it's not clear what the internet has done for us. I mean, as far as I can tell, the internet is hugely negative, aside from cat pictures and the ability to slightly better communicate with friends and relatives. And most of the time, people don't use it for that. They use it to like attack their enemies on Twitter or to watch porn. It's just dumb. And so you can imagine where a future, again, and this kind of relates to our earlier discussion, why not? You can achieve the necessary space for people to spend their time on virtue by simply dialing back the scope of technology.
Right. Okay. So I think again, in principle, I agree this could be done for a time by some people. But what I would say, though, is back to your, Prophets of Doom versus the Wizards.
Mm-hmm.
The Wizards are always right. This has been the perennial question our side has been dealing with. Given the pressures and forces of technology on us, can we build an intentional firewall to preserve tradition in the face of technology? And I would argue that history has shown that you can't. Because over a long enough time frame, and we're seeing this now with the Amish even, that they're beginning to integrate with this technological system. Yeah, and so what I'm saying is it puts us in a difficult problem. But what I'm saying is that even without anyone intentionally being Dr. Evil rubbing their hands, efficiency is nice. It's nice. And when efficiency synergizes, it's even nicer. And
what's nice about efficiency?
Well, I know if you go to the meta philosophical question, yes, there are problems with efficiency. But
the answer is, I agree. There's no firewalls. We need to burn the entire society to the waterline. I mean, that's the only way this works. You burn everything, and then you have to rebuild it. It's not. I totally agree that any kind of islands of sanity or islands of a different way of approaching life will be overwhelmed. You have to burn everything to the waterline and rebuild it. That's the answer. I mean, but the good news is that our society is burning itself to the waterline, most of all by not having any children. So the kind of coming fracture is approaching on a number of axes, but the demographic collapse in itself is going to entirely reset the society, the global society.
Oh no, I agree with all that. But what I'm saying is, even if we go through this process, and then as I understand, correct me if I'm wrong, with your foundationalism, you believe that on the other side of this, a new, better directed technological arc can be pursued. Well, what I'm saying is technology as itself, right? Because there's been in the 20th century, communism, fascism, and democracy have all tried to manage technology according to their narrow political perspective. And what we've seen over time is that they're all converging on homogenization because they're all using the same technologies. Mm-hmm. And so the underlying commonality is trumping their political ideologies over time. And so I don't see how despite anyone's best intentions, we wouldn't end up back here another 200 years.
I want to quibble just real quick with that. That I'm going to get in trouble for saying this, but it's not at all clear that fascism got a decent shot at that. That is, fascism was not in fact converging because there was no time. I mean, fascism was such a, however you define fascism precisely, I would say authoritarian right-wingism is of a kind of extreme variety, was of such brief duration that it's not at all clear that it would have ultimately used technology in the same way at all.
Well, with I think a handful of exceptions, the right-wing authoritarians haven't been very adept at innovation. Mid-20th century Germans, obviously notwithstanding. But everybody else, the Italians, the Spanish, the Argentinians, the Chileans,
but they're all Mediterraneans. You need to get back to
right.
I mean, no, I agree, but that's not, my point is that I don't think it's been tried and found wanting quite as much as your statement would imply.
Well, okay, I think we can agree with democracy on the one hand, socialism on the other. We have seen this. The results are in. This homogenization process is such that it's so similar. One thing, though, that I'm normally very critical of the libertarians, but one thing I will give them is they've said that if you look at the economic policies of the mid-20th century Germans and of the Soviet Union, because they're both totalitarian regimes, there's actually a lot of similarity. And in the analysis that I read that they gave, it seemed convincing enough at the time. Maybe it wouldn't be now, but for me, it was at the time.
That I can't tell you, but economics is obviously closely tied to this, but again, I don't think that fundamentally, I'm accused with large degree of truth of being desiring an authoritarian form of government, though I actually desire a mixed form of government. But it seems to me that authoritarian right-wingism and the things that I want to happen to technology to be tried for the society could best be accomplished by an authoritarian right-wing government. And those things have not been tried. So, I suppose my goal would be to try them, see how it goes. Not, please, just for the record, not in the same manner as mid 20th century Germans, but in a new, fresh, foundationalist manner.
Right. So I think what would be nice then is to wrap this up and then just sort of state as a kind of final statement. So what I would say with regards at least to where we've been discussing just now, that you're technically correct in the sense that historically we haven't seen anything like the timeline necessary to pass the full judgment on how a right-wing authoritarian regime would handle technology over time. What I would say, and again, this is just a guess or a prediction, we don't know yet, is that based on what we do know from the effects of technology already as such, and then on democratic regimes and on socialist regimes, and then given the power ratchet effect that it has, I think it's a safe bet that since no one so far has been able to handle it, and given what we know about the actual limitations of these right-wing authoritarian regimes, they might do better in the short term, possibly, but I think in the end they would still succumb in a similar fashion. Now, again, we haven't seen that. That's just my prediction based on the other available evidence that we have. And that's what I'll end with. So I'll ask you your final thought.
I'm okay if that doesn't work out with the village blacksmith and the village cooper on the village green, the world made by hand. I'm really not that down on that possible future either. So what I don't want the current future of technology. I would take the complete dissipation of society based upon Tainter's and Kunstler's and Greer's analysis over our current arc any day.
All right. Well, again, first of all, where can people find you, Charles, and your work?
Theworthyhouse.com is where I typically write. I'll show up on Twitter occasionally, but only for the lulls. To go to the Worthy House, that's where I have my book reviews or rather my rants that masquerade as book reviews.
All right. Well, again, thank you so much for appearing. It was a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you.
This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.